Some promises are so powerful that even silence remembers them. The rain had been falling for nearly 3 hours over the coastal outskirts of Astoria, Oregon, turning the narrow back roads into ribbons of dark glass beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. The scent of salt from the Pacific drifted inland, mixing with wet pine and cold earth. Headlights cut through the mist as Ethan Walker guided his aging pickup along a forgotten county road lined with towering evergreens. At 38, Ethan carried himself with the quiet discipline of a former U.S. Marine. His shoulders were broad, his posture steady, but his eyes held the weight of years that had not been kind. A faded pair of dog tags rested beneath his flannel jacket, hidden from view but never far from his thoughts. He had come to Oregon seeking something he could not name. Maybe peace, maybe purpose, maybe simply a reason to stop feeling like a stranger in his own life. The storm intensified as thunder rolled far out over the ocean. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Then something appeared at the edge of the headlights. At first he thought it was debris blown from a fallen tree. A dark shape stood motionless beside the ditch, barely visible through the rain. He slowed instinctively. The figure did not move. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. It was a German shepherd. Thin, soaked, alone. The dog stood perfectly still despite the cold wind pushing against its fur. Water streamed from its coat. One ear drooped slightly while the other remained alert. Yet what struck Ethan most was not the animal's condition. It was its eyes. Amber. Steady. Watching him as if it had been waiting. Ethan pulled onto the shoulder and stepped into the rain. The cold immediately soaked through his sleeves. "Easy there," he called softly. The dog neither retreated nor approached. It simply held his gaze. The world seemed strangely quiet despite the storm. No passing cars. No distant voices. Only rain tapping against leaves and the low whisper of wind through the trees. Ethan took another careful step forward. "You lost, buddy." The shepherd blinked once. Then, without warning, it turned and began walking toward the forest. Not running. Not wandering. Walking with purpose. Ethan frowned. The dog stopped after several yards and looked back over its shoulder. Waiting. Something about the moment felt impossible to ignore. He had spent years learning to trust instinct. On distant deployments, hesitation often mattered more than strength. And right now, every instinct told him this was not chance. The shepherd took a few more steps into the darkness and stopped again. Waiting. Ethan glanced toward his truck, then back at the dog. Rain drummed against the branches overhead. Somewhere deep within the forest came a faint sound carried by the wind. A cry. Weak. Brief. Almost swallowed by the storm. Ethan's heart skipped. The shepherd's ears lifted. Then the dog looked directly at him once more, and for the first time Ethan understood. The animal was not asking for help. It was leading him somewhere. The shepherd disappeared between the towering pines, moving with a confidence that made Ethan follow despite every sensible reason to turn back. Rainwater dripped from the branches above, splashing onto the forest floor in a steady rhythm. Mud clung to his boots as he stepped over roots and fallen limbs, keeping the faint silhouette in sight. Every few yards the dog stopped and looked back, never impatient, never afraid, simply making certain he was still there. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the world became. The distant road vanished behind layers of trees. Even the wind seemed softer beneath the dense canopy. Ethan listened carefully. For several moments he heard nothing but rain. Then it came again. A weak sound. Small. Fragile. Almost impossible to detect. He stopped walking. The shepherd stopped too. Another faint cry drifted through the darkness. Ethan felt a knot form in his chest. The sound was not coming from far away. It was close. Very close. The shepherd turned sharply and moved downhill through a narrow opening between two massive cedar trees. Ethan followed, sliding carefully along the wet slope. At the bottom of the incline, the forest opened into a small clearing hidden from the road and nearly invisible from above. There stood an abandoned hunting cabin weathered by decades of storms. Its roof sagged slightly. Moss covered much of the structure. One window hung crooked while the porch leaned at an angle. The place looked forgotten by everyone except time itself. The shepherd trotted directly toward the cabin and stopped beside the porch steps. Ethan approached slowly. The cries came again. Louder now. His pulse quickened. He crouched and peered beneath the porch through the darkness. At first he saw only shadows. Then movement. Tiny movement. his breath caught. Curled together against the driest corner beneath the cabin were 3 German shepherd puppies. They could not have been more than a few weeks old. Their small bodies trembled from the cold. One lifted its head weakly and released the tiny cry he had heard through the storm. Ethan immediately removed his jacket and knelt in the mud. "Easy now," he whispered. The puppies watched him with cloudy eyes, too young to understand much beyond hunger and discomfort. He carefully wrapped the jacket around them, creating a barrier against the cold wind creeping beneath the porch. When he looked back toward the shepherd, he expected to see relief. Instead, the dog remained focused on the cabin itself, ears forward, body still, watching. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" he asked softly. The shepherd stood and walked toward the cabin door. Then it scratched once against the weathered wood. Not frantically, deliberately. Ethan rose to his feet. Something felt unfinished. If the dog's goal had only been to save the puppies, it would have stayed beside them. But it had not. It wanted him to see something else. Rain tapped gently against the old roof as Ethan stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight. The shepherd waited beside the entrance, amber eyes fixed on him. Then another sound emerged from inside the cabin. Not a cry, not a bark, a slow, strained breath. And suddenly Ethan understood that the puppies were not the only ones waiting to be found. The cabin door resisted at first, swollen from years of rain and neglect. Ethan pressed his shoulder against it gently until it opened with a long creak that echoed through the darkness. A cold draft drifted out carrying the scent of damp wood, dust, and something older, something forgotten. The shepherd stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan followed. The beam from his phone flashlight swept across the room. An iron stove stood silent in one corner. A narrow table leaned against the wall beneath a window streaked with rain. A faded blanket lay crumpled near the fireplace. Everything suggested that someone had once tried to make this place a home. Then his light found the source of the breathing. Curled near the hearth was another German shepherd. Female, older. Her coat, once beautiful, was now dulled by exhaustion and weeks of hardship. She lifted her head slightly as the light reached her eyes. They reflected amber and gold for a brief second before softening. Ethan immediately understood. The puppies outside belonged to her. The shepherd who had led him here moved quietly across the room and settled beside her. The female touched her nose to his muzzle. It was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was simply familiar, the kind of silent exchange that only comes from trust. Ethan crouched beside them. "You stayed with her," he whispered. The male shepherd glanced toward him, then back at the female. Rain tapped against the roof overhead while the fireless cabin sat wrapped in shadows. The female's breathing was shallow but steady. She was tired, hungry, and clearly struggling, yet there was no fear in her eyes. Only concern, not for herself, for the puppies hidden beneath the porch. Ethan had seen that look before. Years earlier, during a difficult deployment overseas, he had watched exhausted men refuse rest until everyone else was safe. Some instincts ran deeper than comfort. Some forms of loyalty ignored every personal cost. He slowly reached out his hand. The female watched carefully. After a moment, she allowed him to stroke the side of her neck. Her fur felt damp and thin beneath his fingers. "You have been carrying a lot," he said softly. The male shepherd remained close, refusing to leave her side even for a second. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. The sight awakened memories he usually kept buried. Memories of a yellow Labrador named Cooper, the service dog who had once waited outside every door Ethan entered. Cooper had been there through sleepless nights, difficult recoveries, and long stretches when the world felt unbearably quiet. 3 years earlier, age had finally caught up with him. Ethan still remembered the empty leash hanging in his garage. The silence afterward had felt larger than grief itself. For a long moment, he simply sat there listening to the rain and the steady breathing of the 2 dogs. Then the female shifted slightly. Her eyes moved toward the door, toward the puppies outside. Even now she was thinking about them. Ethan nodded. "I know," he said. "You are worried about your family." The words barely left his mouth before another discovery caught his attention. Near the fireplace, partially hidden beneath an old blanket, rested a worn leather collar. Ethan picked it up carefully. A tarnished metal tag hung from the buckle. He brushed away years of dust with his thumb and turned it toward the light. The engraved name was still visible. Daisy. Beneath the name was a phone number so faded it was almost gone. Ethan stared at the collar, then at the female shepherd. Daisy. She was not a stray after all. Somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the forest, there might still be someone who had once called her family. The storm finally began to weaken sometime after midnight. Rain softened to a steady whisper against the cabin roof, while Ethan worked carefully inside the dim room. He found an old metal bucket beneath the sink and collected clean rainwater from a leak near the doorway. The puppies drank first when he carried them inside one by one, wrapping them in spare blankets he discovered in a storage chest. The male shepherd never left Daisy's side, watching every movement with quiet vigilance. Ethan checked the faded number on the collar again. Most of the digits were worn nearly smooth, but enough remained to offer hope. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the window. One bar of signal flickered briefly, then vanished. He moved closer to the doorway. Nothing. The forest was too remote. Whatever answers waited beyond the storm would have to wait until morning. Back inside, he sat beside the cold fireplace while the dogs rested. The cabin glowed faintly beneath the beam of a lantern he found hanging on a rusted hook. Its warm light softened the years of neglect, making the place feel less abandoned and more like a memory that had simply been left alone for too long. Ethan studied the photographs scattered across a dusty shelf. Most were damaged by moisture, their edges curled and faded. Yet one picture remained surprisingly clear. It showed a smiling older man standing beside a young German shepherd near a fishing boat. The dog looked remarkably familiar. The same alert ears, the same amber eyes. Ethan lifted the frame carefully. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were 4 words. Daisy, summer of 2018. He glanced toward the shepherd lying near the hearth. Daisy slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. For a moment the years seemed to disappear. She was not just a struggling mother hidden in the woods. She had once belonged somewhere. She had once been loved enough to have her picture framed and displayed. Ethan felt an ache he could not fully explain. Too many people assumed animals simply survived one day at a time. But loyalty left traces. It left memories. It left empty places when someone disappeared. Near dawn, he drifted into a light sleep against the wall. A soft sound woke him. Not a bark. Not a cry. The male shepherd was standing at the door, completely still, staring outside. Ethan rose and opened it slowly. Pale gray light filtered through the trees. The storm had passed. Mist floated between the pines like smoke. The shepherd stepped onto the porch and looked toward the distant hills. Ethan followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then, far beyond the clearing, a small beam of light appeared through the fog. It moved slowly, steadily, like headlights traveling an old forest road. The shepherd's ears lifted. Daisy struggled to raise her head from inside the cabin. Something had changed in the room. Not fear, not tension, recognition. Ethan watched the distant light weave through the trees and felt the same strange certainty he had felt when he first saw the dog beside the road. Somehow, after all these years and all these miles, the story that had brought Daisy to this forgotten cabin was finally beginning to find its way home. The distant headlights grew brighter as morning unfolded across the forest. Sunlight struggled through layers of mist, painting the clearing in pale gold and silver. Ethan stepped off the porch and watched the vehicle approach along the narrow logging road. The male shepherd stood beside him, alert but calm. Inside the cabin, Daisy had lifted her head higher than she had at any point during the night. Her eyes remained fixed on the window. Whatever strength she had left seemed anchored to that approaching light. The truck finally emerged from the trees and rolled slowly into the clearing. It was an old green pickup coated with mud and pine needles. The engine stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the driver's door opened. An elderly man stepped out carefully. He appeared to be in his early 70s, tall but slightly stooped with age. His gray beard was trimmed short, and his weathered jacket carried the scent of cedar and lake water. He looked around the clearing with trembling uncertainty. Then his eyes landed on the cabin. Ethan noticed something immediately. The man's expression changed. Hope and disbelief collided all at once. "Daisy," he whispered. The word barely carried beyond the porch. Yet inside the cabin, Daisy reacted instantly. Her ears lifted. Her tail gave a faint movement against the floorboards. Ethan stepped aside as the older man approached. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as though he was walking through years instead of yards. The cabin door opened slowly. The man froze in the doorway. For several seconds, neither he nor Daisy moved. They simply stared at one another. Tears filled the corners of the man's eyes before he even spoke. "Girl," he whispered, "you are really here." Daisy pushed herself upright with visible effort. The movement was slow, unsteady, yet determined. The male shepherd remained close, watching carefully. The old man dropped to one knee beside her. His hand trembled as it reached toward her face. The moment his fingers touched her fur, something remarkable happened. Daisy leaned forward and rested her head against his chest. The man closed his eyes. Years of worry seemed to pour out of him in silence. Ethan quietly stepped back. Some reunions deserve privacy. Through fragments of conversation, the story slowly emerged. The man's name was Walter Bennett. For years earlier, Daisy had disappeared during a violent coastal storm while accompanying him near a remote fishing property several counties away. Search teams had looked for weeks. Flyers had been posted. Shelters had been contacted. Eventually, everyone assumed she was gone. Everyone except Walter. Every year, he continued searching. Every year, he followed rumors and sightings. Every year, he refused to stop believing. Ethan showed him the collar and the photograph from the shelf. Walter smiled through tears. "That was my old cabin," he said softly. "I sold the land years ago, but Daisy knew it." She remembered. Ethan looked toward the male shepherd resting beside the hearth. "And him?" Walter shook his head. "I have never seen that dog before." Silence settled across the room. The answer only deepened the mystery. Somehow this shepherd had found Daisy. Somehow he had protected her and her puppies through hardship and isolation. And somehow he had known exactly where to find help. Walter studied the dog thoughtfully. The shepherd met his gaze for a moment before looking away toward the forest outside, as if part of him belonged somewhere beyond the clearing. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and noticed something strange. Beyond the trees, hidden near the edge of the woods, stood a small wooden marker weathered by time. The shepherd was staring directly at it. The wooden marker stood beneath a cluster of cedar trees about 50 yards beyond the clearing. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering patches of gold across the moss-covered ground. The male shepherd rose quietly and began walking toward it. Ethan exchanged a glance with Walter before following. Daisy remained inside the cabin with her puppies, resting peacefully for the first time since they had found her. The forest felt different now. The storm had washed everything clean. The air carried the scent of wet pine needles and earth warmed by the returning sun. Birds had begun singing again, filling the silence that had lingered through the long night. The shepherd moved ahead with measured steps, never rushing, never looking back. When he reached the marker, he sat beside it. Ethan approached slowly. The wood was weathered and leaning slightly to one side. Moss covered much of the surface. Kneeling, Ethan brushed away the green growth with his hand. Letters slowly emerged beneath the dirt and years. Walter inhaled sharply. The inscription was simple. Ranger, beloved friend. 2015 to 2023. Ethan stared at the name. Walter remained silent for several moments before speaking. "I know that dog." His voice had softened. "He belonged to my neighbor." Ethan looked up. Walter stepped closer to the marker. "Ranger was one of the finest dogs I ever knew. Loyal, gentle, smart enough to open gates and stubborn enough to ignore every command he disagreed with." A faint smile touched his face. The entire valley knew him. Ethan glanced at the shepherd sitting beside the marker. The resemblance was undeniable. Same build, same dark coat, same amber eyes. Yet that was impossible. Walter noticed the confusion in his expression. "Ranger passed away almost 2 years ago," he said quietly. The forest seemed to grow still around them. Ethan looked back at the dog. The shepherd remained calm, watching neither man nor marker. Instead, he appeared focused on the distant horizon beyond the trees. Ethan felt an unexpected chill despite the warming morning. Reason told him there had to be an explanation. Another dog. A coincidence. A relative. Yet something deep inside him resisted the easy answer. The old Marine in him trusted facts. But another part of him, the part shaped by loss and memory, understood that some things could not be measured so easily. Walter knelt beside the marker and brushed away a few remaining leaves. When Ranger died, his owner buried him here. This was his favorite place in the woods. His eyes drifted toward the shepherd. "Strange thing is, your friend showed up only after Daisy disappeared into these forests." Neither man spoke for a while. Wind stirred gently through the branches overhead. Then Ethan noticed movement. The shepherd stood. He stepped forward and touched his nose lightly against the wooden marker. One brief gesture. One quiet farewell. After that, he turned and began walking back toward the cabin. Ethan followed slowly, his thoughts tangled in questions. By the time they reached the clearing, Daisy was resting comfortably in a patch of sunlight streaming through the open doorway. Her puppies slept against her side. For the first time, she looked peaceful. The shepherd paused near the porch and watched them. His expression seemed almost satisfied, as though the mission that had carried him through storm, darkness, and distance was finally nearing its end. The afternoon passed slowly beneath a sky that had finally turned clear. Sunlight spilled across the clearing and warmed the cabin walls that had endured years of rain and solitude. Ethan repaired what he could. A loose shutter, a broken latch, small things, familiar things. Work had always helped him think. Meanwhile, Walter remained close to Daisy and the puppies, speaking softly as though making up for every lost year. The puppies responded first to his voice. Tiny tails wagged whenever he approached. Their eyes had begun to brighten. Their movements carried the fearless curiosity of creatures too young to understand how close they had come to hardship. Daisy watched them constantly, yet something had changed in her. The strain that had weighed upon her seemed lighter now. The worry had not vanished completely, but it no longer rested on her shoulders alone. The shepherd remained nearby throughout the afternoon. Sometimes he sat beneath the old cedar tree overlooking the clearing. Sometimes he rested near the porch steps, always watching, always present, yet never demanding attention. As the sun drifted lower, Ethan carried a bowl of water outside and paused beside him. "You know," he said quietly, "I still do not understand how you found me." The shepherd lifted his head. His amber eyes reflected the evening light. For a brief moment, Ethan was reminded of every loyal companion he had ever known. Men who had stood beside him when things were difficult. Friends who had carried burdens without being asked. Cooper, Ranger, names that still echoed in quiet corners of memory. The shepherd nudged Ethan's hand gently. Then he stood and walked toward the edge of the clearing. Ethan followed with his eyes. The dog stopped beside a fallen log where wildflowers had begun to bloom after the rain. He seemed content simply to watch the forest. The sight stirred something inside Ethan. For years he had carried grief like extra weight in a backpack. Not overwhelming, just always there. The loss of Cooper. The long, lonely stretches after leaving military service. The feeling that purpose belonged to another chapter of life. Yet standing in this clearing surrounded by people and animals who had somehow found one another against impossible odds, that weight felt different. Lighter. Not gone, but shared. As dusk settled over the woods, Walter prepared a small fire in the old stove. The cabin filled with warmth for the first time in years. Orange light danced across the walls. Shadows flickered across the photographs and weathered furniture. Outside, the forest darkened into deep shades of blue and silver. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying a mug of coffee. Crickets had begun their evening song. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth. He glanced toward the place where the shepherd had been sitting. The spot was empty. Ethan frowned slightly and scanned the clearing. No movement. No dark silhouette near the trees. No shape resting beside the path. He set down the mug and walked slowly around the cabin. Nothing. The dog was gone. Not a sound had marked his departure. No tracks stood out in the soft ground. Only the gentle sway of grass touched by evening wind. Ethan stood quietly beneath the first stars appearing overhead. Strangely, he did not feel worried. He felt grateful. Behind him, laughter drifted from inside the cabin as Walter watched the puppies tumble across a blanket. Daisy rested peacefully near the fire. The clearing felt whole again. Ethan looked toward the dark forest one last time. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called softly into the night. And for reasons he could not explain, it sounded less like a goodbye and more like a promise kept. Morning arrived quietly over the forest. Thin ribbons of sunlight slipped through the cedar branches and stretched across the clearing where dew sparkled like scattered glass. Ethan woke early, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of the cabin settling into another day. Instead, he heard something better. The playful yips of the puppies. He stepped outside and found them exploring the grass near the porch under Walter's watchful eye. Their tiny paws stumbled through clover and wildflowers, chasing drifting leaves and discovering the world one curious step at a time. Daisy rested nearby, her head lifted proudly as she watched them. Strength had begun returning to her. Her coat looked healthier already, and her eyes no longer carried the same exhaustion Ethan had first seen inside the cabin. Hope had a way of changing living things. Walter stood beside the fence line with a gentle smile. "I have not seen her this peaceful in years," he said softly. Ethan looked toward Daisy and nodded. Maybe she finally knows she does not have to carry everything alone anymore. The older man glanced toward the woods where the shepherd had vanished the night before. Maybe that was the whole point. Neither man spoke for a while. The forest seemed content to fill the silence itself. A breeze stirred through the trees. Somewhere high above, an eagle circled against the blue Oregon sky. The world felt larger and kinder than it had only days earlier. Later that afternoon, Ethan helped Walter load supplies into the truck. The plan was simple. Walter would bring Daisy and the puppies home to the small property near the coast where he still lived. There would be veterinarians, warm beds, open fields, and people who would care for them. The abandoned cabin had served its purpose. It had sheltered a family long enough for them to be found. Before leaving, Walter walked one final time through the clearing. He paused beside the old cedar trail, leading toward the wooden marker hidden among the trees. Then he removed a small object from his pocket. It was a polished brass tag engraved with a single name, Ranger. He carried it quietly into the forest. Ethan waited near the truck while the old man disappeared among the pines. When Walter returned 20 minutes later, his eyes were moist but peaceful. He did not explain what he had done. He did not need to. Some conversations belong only to the heart. As the afternoon sun lowered toward the horizon, Daisy climbed carefully into the truck. The puppies followed, tumbling over one another in a pile of ears and paws. Walter settled into the driver's seat and rolled down the window. "You know," he said, looking at Ethan, "I spent 4 years searching for one dog. Turns out I found a lot more than that." Ethan smiled. "So did I." The truck pulled away slowly, disappearing down the forest road beneath clouds glowing gold and amber. Ethan remained in the clearing long after the engine sound faded. The cabin stood quietly behind him. The woods stretched endlessly ahead. Yet for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. As evening settled across the valley, he walked toward the cedar grove one last time. There, beside the weathered marker, rested the brass tag Walter had left behind. The setting sun touched it with a warm golden light. Ethan stood silently, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind move through the trees. It carried no answers, no explanations, only peace. And somehow that was enough. Weeks passed, and the memory of the storm slowly settled into something gentler. Autumn arrived along the Oregon coast with cool mornings and skies painted in soft shades of gold and blue. Ethan found himself returning often to the old cabin. At first he came to finish repairs. Then he came because the place no longer felt abandoned. It felt meaningful. The broken shutters were replaced. The porch stood straight again. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls. Wildflowers bloomed along the path leading into the clearing. What had once seemed forgotten now felt alive. One crisp Saturday morning, a familiar green pickup appeared at the end of the road. Walter stepped out smiling. Behind him tumbled 3 energetic young shepherds, no longer fragile puppies, but growing dogs filled with curiosity and confidence. Daisy followed close behind, her coat shining in the sunlight. The years had not disappeared from her eyes, but peace had settled there. Ethan knelt as the young dogs bounded toward him. Their playful energy filled the clearing with life. Walter laughed softly. "Looks like they remember you." Ethan rubbed one puppy behind the ears and smiled. Maybe they remember kindness. The day passed with simple joys. Coffee shared on the porch. Stories exchanged beneath the cedar trees. Puppies chasing leaves through the grass. As evening approached, Walter handed Ethan a small wooden frame. Inside was a new photograph. Daisy rested beside her growing family while the sun set behind them in a wash of amber light. On the back, Walter had written a single sentence. "Some hearts guide us home even after they are gone." Ethan stood quietly for a long moment. Beyond the clearing, the forest glowed beneath the fading light. The cedar grove stood silent in the distance. The brass tag still rested beside the old marker, catching the last rays of sunset. No answers had ever come. No explanation had ever appeared. Yet somehow none was needed. because the truth was already there in front of him. A lonely Marine had found purpose again. A lost dog had found her family. 3 puppies had found a future. An old man had been reunited with a friend he never stopped believing in. And somewhere within that chain of quiet mercies was a lesson too deep for words. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and ocean salt across the valley. Ethan closed his eyes and listened. Not every miracle arrives with thunder. Not every rescue makes headlines. Sometimes grace appears on 4 paws, walking silently through the rain. Sometimes loyalty travels farther than reason can follow. And sometimes the smallest act of compassion saves more than one life. As darkness settled over the forest and the first stars emerged above the clearing, Ethan looked toward the cedar grove one final time. Then he smiled and turned toward the warm light of the cabin, where laughter, friendship, and the promise of tomorrow were waiting. The night grew quiet. The forest stood watch. And somewhere beyond sight, a promise remained unbroken.